Greetings, everyone. Welcome to the Swedenborgian online community's Thursday chat. We are greatly honored to have Reverend Anna Woofenden with us this evening as the founding pastor of the Garden Church and the Feed and Be Fed Farm in San Pedro, California, where they're reimagining church as an interconnected organism, worshiping, loving, and serving together while transforming a downtown plot of land into a vibrant urban farm and sanctuary. Reverend Anna, through this process, has become quite the leading voice in the food and faith movement, particularly in the area of liturgy, which you're wonderful at, Reverend Anna, and entrepreneurial ministry. She has also started and co-hosts the Food and Faith podcast, which is quite amazing if you haven't checked it out, where they uplift people in spirituality and healthy nourishment of all kinds. And Reverend Anna has been quite the insightful minister and mentor for me over the years. Welcome, Reverend Anna. We are quite blessed to have you here this evening.
Reverend Cory, it's such a pleasure to be here. To call you fellow Reverend, being able to watch your journey over the last number of years, it's been a real honor. So I'm glad to be able to participate in your ministry tonight.
Well, it really is my honor, and I should mention for our listeners that you really were my minister for my time in the LA area. I loved connecting with you and your ministry and the beauty of its vision at the Garden Church. So I thank you for your wisdom and your heartfelt support over the years, Reverend.
Well, and your listeners and your congregation should know that it was integral in our first months of those early times. You're starting the church from scratch. You never know if anyone's going to show up, and you're going to be there all by yourself. And it was such a blessing to know that there would be a few committed people who would be there for sure. And Cory was one of those. And so you will forever have a place in that story of the founding of the Garden Church.
Well, thank you, Reverend. And I want to also thank those of you all in our Chatsy, sharing and connecting. It's great to see you all there. Please share your questions for Reverend Anna, your comments. I'm sure some of you have met her before, and it's nice, the Swedenborgian community around the United States and North America, that we are pretty small and we can connect with each other over time. We get to know each other in such beautiful spirits as Reverend Anna. Reverend, could you tell us where you're connecting with us from and how you got there? What your business and ministry is like today?
So I am currently in my home in rural Ohio, in Gambier, Ohio, which is about an hour and a half east of Columbus, doing what I'm calling non-geographically bound ministry, which basically means that I travel a lot, and then I'm in this home office that I'm in right now a lot. I am continuing to work as the consultant for new ministry initiatives with the Swedenborg Chapel in Cambridge, working with Reverend Sage Cole and the congregation there. And we have had a really, really wonderful year looking at where they are and where they could go. And so we're enjoying that. I'm there about once a month. And I'm working locally here in Mount Vernon, which is about 10 minutes away, at the local United Church of Christ church, where they have hired me to be their visiting pastor of peace and spirituality 5 hours a week. So just basically one Sunday a month. And I've really enjoyed having some local ministry and being able to explore different practices around peacemaking with that congregation. And then I am doing some other coaching and consulting and speaking around the country. And then I am writing. I am really excited that I was able to get a book contract to write a book about the story of the founding of the Garden Church and about this broader notion of reimagining church, how we can be faithful in this generation. So my ministry is multifaceted at the moment, which is it's a nice it's a nice variety of things.
Yeah, sure sounds like it. And reimagining church is such an important thing today. And I find your ministry especially is an exemplar of this. And, we say in this community that we're an affirming interfaith community seeking to uplift all peoples. And I think a big part of that message, that heart, I found in your ministry so far. And it's beautiful to hear that you have such an eclectic mix to connect with people and uplift them. That's wonderful. And I've...
Oh, and the podcast.
sorry.
I forgot to tell you about the podcast.
Oh, yeah.
That's the other thing I'm doing. See, I have too many things. My colleague, Reverend Sam Chamberlain, and I started co-hosting and started a podcast on food and faith. And that has been such a joy. We have been working on it, I guess, almost a year now, but launched in September. And you can find it at foodandfaithpodcast.org or Food and Faith Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher, wherever you listen to your podcasts. But that has been really a very enlivening project to talk to people at all different intersections of food and faith. So we've talked to lawyers and farmers and pastors and food studies experts, and just really interesting to dive into that intersection, which I, of course, obviously have been exploring in depth in a particular setting at the Garden Church, but now to explore it in this broader setting and in other people's particular settings is really, it's been another fun hat that I'm wearing these days.
Yeah, that sounds fun. And I listened to the podcast. It's fantastic. It's really great. Yeah. Well, it's nice to hear, different people's perspectives on farming, urban farming, healthy agriculture, the issues today, and also how to connect with people spiritually in relation to food and faith and in all these different guises. And I feel like your podcast is an amazing job connecting with all sorts of folks in their wisdom, and you all share yours as well. So it's quite inspiring, honestly. I'm sure your other ministries are quite amazing as well. I know one thing I really enjoyed about my time at the Garden Church is your approach to sharing messages, liturgy, and connecting with people. I found it quite wondrous and beautiful often, your ministry in that regard. And I'm curious, how's it shaping with Sage Cole and did you say the United Church of Christ?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that I am appreciating about this season, but also missing in this season, is that I'm not with one community regularly, and I'm not the pastor or the lead pastor of any community. So it's not within my repertoire to be the one who is shaping those rhythms of liturgy, which is something that I really enjoyed, and honestly I miss. I think what I can appreciate about the season is that I'm getting to see and support other people in their gifts and in their shaping, and so being more of a cheerleader, a sounding board, someone who can come in and help to feedback and maybe enhance what is going on, but not being the architect of it. So that has certainly been a new role to explore. And I think there are many different things that I miss about the Garden Church, but I think one of them is that, like, week to week being the one responsible for holding the rhythm of the liturgy and holding the congregation in regular worship. And it's not something that I have quite in my life right now.
Why do you feel drawn to ministry in general, and what were some of the things you took away from your ministry at the Garden Church? I'm curious.
Um, well, I mean, I think that so in my biography, so I'm here at the tail end of Generation X, and that kind of Generation X millennial gap or bridge, whichever way you want to say it. And there are plenty of my peers either never were involved in church, but more frequently were growing up and then have left it for whatever reason. And I get that. Like, I don't have any judgment on that. I think that there are plenty of experiences of church that have honestly either been hurtful to people or just not that useful. And so my call to ministry, my understanding is that is true of church in general. That's not about a specific denomination or specific group. I mean, it's just this is something I think that we all get to, all those of us who consider ourselves wanting to be part of church, or particularly church leaders, get to look at, is that, there's something that is not serving many people at this point. But I'm not quite willing to give up on it. I think there's something really powerful that happens when we gather together to love God and love neighbor. But I think that it is our responsibility to reimagine it. And reimagine it to me does not mean that all a new idea, or that suddenly we're going to have I'm going to have the brilliant idea that's going to, quote, save the church. I think reimagining it is a faithful response to be people of faith, to people in the Christian tradition, to be faith leaders. It's something that's been happening throughout centuries, right? That church has in suburbia, right? like church has always been reinventing itself, and so that, I would say, is really at the core of both my call to ministry, but also my own faith journey, that I'm not willing to say, oh, those young people, I just need to get over it and come to church the way that I've always had it, and that doesn't feel responsible to me. And I don't want to give up on it. So I think that it is part of that faithful response to keep asking the questions of both, what is God calling us to next? And that's been something really beautiful. I mean, certainly I was able to do that at the Garden Church, but it's been very beautiful to say, okay, so you can start a new church in the middle of an empty lot in Los Angeles. What about an old stone chapel in the middle of Harvard Square? Like, what's the next season of ministry for that? And that looks very different, but it's similar questions that we get to ask. And so what does it mean to be faithful in our generation?
Yeah, well, what inspired reflection, Reverend Anna. I think it really is a true calling that you're describing, because you feel called to serve others and create community, which is what so many of us are lacking today. We find some semblance of it, of course, in work and different activities and online, but often people don't create space to connect together, whether online or in person, in intentional ways, seeking to uplift each other, uplift their spirituality, and it really has been something that has fallen away, as you say, probably for some good reasons.
There
in part,
wasn't an internet,
right? And I think it's really
and so I think that is
a really high view for you to come in and say, okay, well, let's continue to reflect this on this and reshape it for changing attitudes and changing people and society.
And it's not.
I think that's what
they're
is
not all going to look the same. I think that's the other thing that is just so beautiful to me. And in doing the podcast, this has been, I mean, even to broaden it out beyond specifically church, about like these intersections of, where are people coming together in purposeful ways and with spiritual grounding. I don't know, I just think God is so much bigger and more creative than we give her credit for. Like, I think that it's so easy to, keep it in that narrow little box. Of, you've heard me say this many times, but I often reflect on the two gardens that we see at either end of the biblical narrative, and that Garden of Eden, while it had many good and wonderful things, it was set apart, right? It was pristine. It was somehow, in some ways, the way that I think sometimes we think that maybe church is supposed to be, is this sacred set apart thing, which church can serve certainly a purpose of sanctuary and peace, but then the garden that really just captures me, and of course in the Swedenborgian tradition is one of the images and the metaphors that many of our churches are named after, is this heavenly city, New Jerusalem, ascending, and that in that city you have a garden as well. That the river is right in the middle of the city. The tree of life is there, and that there's no temple because God is everywhere. And when we talk about the second coming and that descending of the heavenly city, this new way of more heaven here on earth, I think it is much more mixed in with life and culture, and it's in the middle of the city. The city has 12 gates with all different kinds of people coming in. There's not an explicit temple because God is everywhere and working in it. And I think that particularly as Swedenborgians, with our theology around this descending of the heavenly city, I feel for myself, and I would welcome other Swedenborgians if it resonated with you, that we have a responsibility to have our eyes out for that, to have our eyes out for where is the heavenly city descending, and then how can we help cultivate that. And P.S., it's not just in the Swedenborgian church.
Yeah.
Right? Like, it's just, and it's not just in what we think of as church either. I think that that's really important too. While I personally believe strongly in having communities come together to worship and study and pray and sing, and but I think the heavenly city is, I don't know, I just go back to, it's got 12 gates. It's a lot of different ways to be in spiritual community together.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. 12 gates, 3 on each side, and I think that's quite the message, that all these diverse people come together, and that creates heaven and leads to its perfection and beauty, as that diversity does. And thank you for uplifting that idea, and also, the idea of looking for the heavenly city descending really speaks to me when you say to look at it in all peoples and in all things, and that really kind of opens the door, for all of our ministries, whether we're called by other people minister or not. I'll call you all ministers, and just like looking into other people's eyes and seeing the beauty of that city of God, connecting more and more with that person and wanting to uplift that. I think that's quite the message, Reverend.
I think it's something that we are all called to do, because on a one-on-one level, it's looking to see that image of God in all people and all things. We have this beautiful idea in the Swedenborgian tradition of correspondences, and like the physical world has, the natural world has this spiritual reality infused in it. Sometimes I think we maybe forget to look at that in each other. That, you know, as I can go outside and see the beauty of a tree and see God's imprint in that and God's love and wisdom in that. And I think that's important. And I very much support that. It's also true of each face that we meet. And maybe we can particularly have our eyes out for the faces that we don't as quickly see it in, or that are not as familiar to us. And I think that's also how the heavenly city descends, that it descends into places that are receptive, that where the influx can come in. And so when we can show up in the world looking for the face of God in all people, looking for the presence of a more heavenly way of being, and then actively inviting that and cultivating it, then it takes root a little more. There's a little more heaven here on earth.
Yes, and to reflect what you said a moment ago, Dr. Rebecca Esterson shared how she likes to think of looking and approaching the stranger as approaching the sacred. And I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah, right? Doesn't that just change everything? I mean, you know, we don't have to get like explicitly political here, but like just us being a world citizen, right? Like that there's a lot of horrible, hateful things that are happening and that have happened throughout centuries and generations because we don't approach the face of the stranger in that way, right? Like that's kind of one of those core things. I mean, I think that would change. It does change, not just it would. It changes things when we can approach other people looking for.
Yeah, in a world where with so many refugees and us, you know, a step away from being refugees, in all honesty, as even in these Western countries, I think it's important to, accept people and uplift them where they're at, especially in a country like the United States, where both of us are right now, that has essentially instigated a lot of the issues in Latin America, South America, and yet we're so closed off to supporting the people impacted by our policies, economic and political, and say, oh, they're not welcome here. And we often say that's the religious thing to do, you know. It's because of our party lines and how things have kind of played out in terms of the misuse of religion, I think, often in politics. Often it's a Christian voice that says, we don't want the refugees here.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And I think it's, it is not how I understand Christianity. I think we come from a tradition that is clear throughout the Hebrew scriptures, clear about the command to welcome the stranger, the command to leave the corner of your field unharvested for the stranger or the person passing by that's hungry. In the New Testament, I mean, you have an explicit, you've got Matthew 25 with explicit commands to care for others, but you also have Jesus. I mean, Jesus' family, they were refugees, and he lived this itinerant life and just broke down every barrier, left and right. You know, touched lepers and women and people from other religious groups and other areas, and it seems to me, my understanding, my experience of the witness in scriptures and in the personhood of Jesus and the Lord's time on earth is that call to see, and that all people really means all people.
Yeah. Well, I want to take a moment to turn to our chatzy and our folks there. I hope you all are enjoying this conversation. I know I am hearing from you, Reverend. Paige shares Reverend Woofenden has a very unique perspective, a founding pastor with weekly responsibility for an innovative church, and now part-time minister and advisor, reimagining the church. It's good to have her perspective that the church has always been reinventing itself. And there's a commonality, people coming together in some way to worship together and learn together. And as well, she appreciates the interesting metaphor that you uplift around the holy city and the 12 gates, inviting diverse people within. Thank you, Paige. Those are insightful and wonderful comments and feedback. I'm curious what you all take from the messages that you've heard from Reverend Anna so far, and how they may speak to your life. And I'm also curious, Reverend Anna, with your time at the Garden Church and the Feed and Be Fed Farm, what were you really struck by interacting with the community and the people there, and reinventing church in such a beautiful, inspiring way?
Oh, yes. I mean, so I could answer that question in so many ways. I mean, one of the things that always, it should not have surprised me because it happened really basically every time we opened the gate. But I think that it was of God that it continued to delight and surprise me. Was this thing that we're talking about, that when you look to see the face of God in all people, and you're purposefully designing a space that continually reminds you that that's what you're there to do, that there's the opportunity to get to know people I never would have gotten to know otherwise, and even more delightful as a pastor to see people interacting with each other that they wouldn't have interacted with otherwise. We had about a third to a half of the congregation on a Sunday would be people who are unhoused, coming from all different life stories and backgrounds. We had people who were quite wealthy and had means and had careers, and many people all the way around in between, and that we would all sit down together and, we would work in the garden together and get our hands dirty, and seeing the interactions that could happen between people while they were, planting carrot seeds or turning the compost, and then being in worship together. And the worship, one of the principles of worship there was very high participation, and that everyone had something to offer to the service in different ways. So one of my favorite things, so as you know, Reverend Cory, from the early days, I like to have a plan and know who was going to do what, and I had to let go of that pretty quickly. And one of the gifts of that was that I started off by always trying to have somebody signed up to read scripture, and that really didn't go very far, because you never quite knew in the early days probably in who's going to show up. So I started just asking, gospel reading today from the Gospel of Mark, who would like to read it today, and the people who volunteer would always just delight me. It would be English as a second language, or the 8-year-old, or the person who just walked through the gate for the first time, and maybe living on the streets or having a rough patch in life, and probably is not asked to do something like read scripture in church. And just the beauty of being open to seeing, okay, where's God's face going to show up now? And continuing to be surprised by that. And then to sit down and eat together. There's something that happens, I think, when we share a meal. At the Garden Church, it's not a soup kitchen or feeding program. It's family dinner. Everyone sits down together, and you have a chance to be in conversation with people that in the past my interaction was just to pass them as they were sitting on the sidewalk, and instead to have genuine relationships and to get to know each other and see the humanity in each other. So that was slash is certainly something that really is beautiful about that particular environment, but also a value and a principle that we all can strive for in whatever our settings are.
Indeed. What a warm and divine enterprise that is. And thank you for sharing your history with that, your herstory with that, and just the amazing community that you helped foster and inspire in other people, because I know a lot of folks within the Swedenborgian community and otherwise have been greatly inspired by your example, specifically with those with that church and that farm, and how innovative and really courageous it was to start it, to lead it, and make it what it is today. And I can only thank you from the bottom of our hearts by leading by such an amazing example, Reverend Anna.
Definitely a team effort, and courageous goes right along with crazy. So,
well,
there's a lot of good support.
Well, I'm sure there's a lot of lessons learned that we can all learn from. And I want to turn back to the chat real quick and uplift a view that I agree with from Albert. He says, I don't think it's a Christian viewpoint that we don't welcome strangers. I think a Christian view must be consistent with Jesus' teachings in the Bible, like welcoming the stranger and feeding the hungry. And I think your church is a prime example of a real Christian approach to things as far as we're concerned. Yes, amen. And Paige uplifts another thought. She says, I keep remembering Reverend Woofenden's marvelous metaphor of the compost pile, that everything has its time and can nurture the growth of something else, and that we cannot predict what the new growth will look like. And she'd love for you to share more about this metaphor.
Sure. Well, believe it or not, I really love compost, which is surprising to some people because it can be kind of gross and smelly. But I started playing with this metaphor a number of years ago, prior to, I think, the Garden Church. I think that Paige and I first had some interactions around this when I attended a presentation at Gathering Leaves and Freiburg. It would have been 2013 or so. And the idea that I presented there, which I have been sort of exploring and learning from in various contexts ever since, is this idea that the church is not, the church could learn, and by the church I mean that in a very broad sense, could learn our lessons from the compost heap, that things that we think are dead and dying and done are actually the things that can be broken down and purposed, can be the soil for what is next. So this idea that there are some particular iterations of church that are dying, and that deserves attention. It deserves grief. It deserves good hospice chaplaincy. But that it's not wrong or bad or a failure. It's part of the natural cycle that things are born, they live, they die. But that as a church, and I mean that again now in the broader sense, that when a specific iteration of church dies, you can think about it like leaves. Like, so the tree, the leaves come down, they're scattered all across the lawn. Maybe this is actually not a great example because apparently that does do good mulch. But let's think of it as your garbage. So you have some banana peels, you have an apple core. If you just kind of scatter them across your lawn, they will eventually decompose and eventually help your lawn maybe to be a little bit more fertile or whatever. But if you put them all purposely on the compost heap, a compost is amazing. And the more that I learned about this, the natural cycle of compost, talk about like correspondences and learning from natural processes, it is amazing. You can have like banana peel to the most richest, wonderful dirt possible in like 6 weeks if you are actively turning your compost pile. And then what happens is all these little microbes like do their work, and that soil that comes out of those banana peels and leaves and whatever is some of the richest, best soil that you can use. It actually helps prevent disease, which is, I think, is really a fascinating correspondence to look at. And that your next vegetables are going to be much stronger, healthier, more delicious, and fabulous. So if you think of that in terms of churches, you think about, think about the churches. I mean, we can see this in our denomination, that we have our ancestors, and you know, in my case, I think about like my great-great-grandparents, that that the things that they gave to the church at their time are things that I'm still appreciating to this day. And so if we think of that, some of the things that we put on the compost heap, if you will, it's not that we're throwing them away, it's that we're saying, like, how do we repurpose it? You know, liturgy, it changes over time, but it's of the same substance, right? There's things that come through our tradition that are handed down. You know, the engagement with our theology, these things that we can either just kind of scatter around the yard and say, well, I'm kind of done with that. Or we can say, like as Dr. Lawrence at Center for Swedenborgian Studies often says, is we can translate Swedenborg forward. We can say, what is that thing that's been part of our history that maybe feels like it's kind of old and done? How do we translate that forward? We can think about this as resources. When a church does close it close when it's gotten to the total end of its rope and has nothing really left to give the next? Or does it close at a time where it's able to say, you know what, we have a healthy endowment, or we have a building resource, and we are going to purposely put that on the compost heap and say, this is for the next generation. This is how we're going to support this forward. And I think we see some strong examples of that happening and not happening, and I think that we can learn from that. So there's a lot of the compost heap metaphor. The more I have explored it and explore it, the more I find that that's the general thought is to think about this life cycle. Think about how when something looks like it's dying, that it's not the end. And think about like the example of Christ, right? Like that the Lord was born, lived a life, was crucified, died, in the tomb for 3 days, and then was resurrected and rose. And our theology's idea of like continues to be that resurrection. We are people of compost. It's not the end. It's what's going to feed the next beginning.
Yeah, wow. Those are amazing thoughts, and I'll mention that we're talking about another form of this renewal and resurrection in some of our other Thursday conversations. We just started a review of Heaven and Hell, Swedenborg's book on the afterlife, and we're summarizing each section pretty briefly and inviting discussion, and it's interesting to hear about his view of that kind of renewal and kind of the compost of this world leading into the next, and how it leads to such beauty and and strength and diversity. That, his descriptions of the afterlife in heaven are full of all these different people, as we were speaking about before, and how that lends to the amazingness and perfection of heaven. The more and more that diversity increases, the compost widens, so to speak.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I appreciate that connection. It seems to be one of these things that's embedded into the created world and the human. I think it's one of those things that's embedded. Life, death, resurrection. I don't think we can actually get away from it. If we keep looking around, it's like, oh, there it is. Oh, there it is. Oh, there.
Well, it's interesting how, like, on every level of creation, from the minutest, 20 levels down in terms of particle physics, if you can even go that far, how these different diverse elements come together to create the properties of the next set of even more diverse elements, and how each level kind of lends itself to more and more compounding and beauty and community and connection. And then eventually, of course, you have human life and nature and everything else, and the spiritual realm, etc. It's kind of amazing what you're saying around it being a microcosm, each level of creation reflecting such a beautiful promise and descent of divinity. And I'll note, to be somewhat selfish here, it's funny that this has come up a couple of times in this conversation around how the church death and our death and church renewal, because I'm working on a sermon entitled "The Church is Dead, Long Live You, the Church," and it's nice because you're providing most of my material. Thank you, Reverend.
Yeah, absolutely. Always happy to share.
Oh,
I look forward to hearing or reading that sermon. That sounds right, just about right to me.
Just right. Well, thank you.
Two, that compost is not pleasant at all stages, and I think that's another important thing we can learn from the compost heap is it's messy, and I think that one of the things that get really confused about, I get confused about, I see people collectively getting confused about, it's not as clear cut as we're dying and we're being reborn, right? It's happening simultaneously. So it's like, hey, which is the death part? Which is the rebirth part? How do those interact? So it's messy.
Yeah, and it can be uncomfortable and at times, right? To give kind of let loose of some of our old habits, maybe, or reform them, our old structures, what we hope for ourselves and others, and that process of change is often a little painful, right? As we can see if we look around the world, and yet, everyone also tells us that statistically crime is down, death is down on the planet, and yet as we learn more and more about how this planet has been working, we see the true messiness and often the destruction that we can wrought, right? That we can create as such creative beings.
I mean, I know we're running up against time, so don't get me started on climate change.
Oh, yeah.
But yes, I mean, I think this is the piece where we have to remember that I believe that providence is over all things and God is holding all things, but I also believe this idea of free will, and as human beings, our agency does things individually and collectively, and that these choices, they certainly impact our traditions and our churches. They impact our world and our globe, and I think that one of the gifts of looking closely at a natural world metaphor such as the compost heap is you see that it really actually matters greatly if you have enough moisture or enough leaves or brown newsprint or some paper or something, and and other, like the pH balance of like these things that like I didn't even know were a thing. They matter, and that's just one little microcosm, right? Like it's like this little compost pile, but that each of those pieces matter. And I think that sometimes I worry that as as heady and spiritual Swedenborgians, we forget that we are living on a physical planet, on a physical world, and that the beauty, I believe, in our teachings is the idea that there's a spiritual reality to that, but it doesn't take away, and in fact, I think it enhances our responsibility to this physical planet and this world that we're on, and that our choices matter. That if we are operating in an individual and collective free will within the workings of providence, that we need to take our choices seriously because they have consequences.
Yeah, you bring up such important and timely points, and yeah, we are near the brink, as you mentioned, as most scientists say, right, and common sense, and it's it's kind of amazing that we still don't feel the call on a global, in any real capacity, it seems, to change what we're doing, and and I think we also have that situation often in our own personal lives where we continue to be destructive, and the people that we care about, and maybe even the deep affection and love that is the source of our life and that really has inspired us even from childhood, we often turn against and start creating these destructive elements around it, and maybe even destroying those relationships on our own personal level. And it's a calling on every aspect of our being, and including ecology. To plug another sermon, we published something called The Goddessness of Ecology a couple months ago, and I agree with you, Reverend Anna. It's such an important idea to not only reflect as Swedenborgians on our internal life, but also on our external life and community as well, and how we're impacting nature. Because Swedenborg, the Bible, many other sages and leaders out there have told us how uplifted, how important nature and ecology is, and we really should take it very very seriously for our own benefit.
Yeah, future generations. I mean, if you want to go back to the compost heap again, that it's not just about us here and now, right? It's about what are we doing for the next generation.
And it's also a reason to reform some of our other destructive habits that have been in the news a lot lately. I'm sure you've followed, and our politicians often getting away with heinous acts and heinous behavior even while they're politicians, and maybe we each do that to some degree as well. Reforming that, because there's real pain around us, and it impacts our wider community and generations to come. How we change and how we address and acknowledge these things.
There's plenty of work for regeneration in each of us and collectively.
Amen, amen. I'll mention Albert, who's speaking to us from Lincoln, Nebraska, says over his long life there, he's been to many church buildings have changed, and they use different denominations over time. They have different denominations and organizations there, and he's really seen the change in the church throughout the years. And I think many of us can relate that, as you were mentioning before, churches aren't nearly as popular as they were, and maybe that's a good thing to some degree, and maybe just reflecting on religion in general and what it is we bring to the table, and real and metaphorical lenses is important. And I think your work uplifts that reflection and also inspiration for what we can aspire to, and on all those different levels. Do you feel like today, like with your podcast and your churches, that you're able to, do you feel satisfied with that? And also, how does writing this new book fall into that calling?
Yeah, this is it's definitely an interesting season, and I appreciate the space to be able to. Though, as I mentioned earlier, I certainly miss that day-to-day pastoral work. This is the opportunity to reflect specifically, certainly in the work of the book, on the experience of planting the garden church, but also more broadly. And I think that there's a gift in being able to be more of an observer, consultant, as a writer, like to be able to have that space to reflect more broadly. And so I feel like that's a gift of this season. I do look forward to putting down roots and to having a more regular community in the future again. And I also think that just as there are different seasons, spring, summer, winter, I miss fall, and there's fall, winter. There are different seasons of life and of ministry, and so I feel grateful that for the seasons there are these various ways to engage and to be reflective, and I hope to be able to be reflective in a way that is informed both by specific experience of the garden church, but also being engaged in a much broader conversation, specifically certainly around the intersection of food and faith, but it weaves in so many of these other questions around ecology and justice and reimagining church and what's the future of the church, but also what's the future of society and culture, and so being able to have the opportunity to look specifically and look broadly is a gift.
Well, I'm glad that you feel like it's a gift, and I know it's a gift for us to receive your wisdom. I'm excited for the book. I'm sure those who get to relate to you on an everyday or weekly or monthly basis are greatly thankful for your deep heart and your wonderful wisdom, as I have. And I really thank you for being so earnest and dedicated to your ministry and your call to service and uplift community in all these ways, to feed people in all these ways. And I think there is a time. I'm reading this book called The Tao of Leadership, and it highlights that there is a time to be more reflective as a leader, to plant, to harvest, to all those things. And I appreciate your wisdom on that matter, and look forward to hearing more from you. Hopefully you can come on the podcast again, and sometime soon. I know that throughout our relationship and our interactions, I always feel deeply inspired and uplifted by your insight, and I'm sure our guests do as well. So thank you very much, Reverend.
Well, thank you so much for having me on. Absolutely, I would love to have a conversation in the future. I wish you many blessings in this new ministry, Reverend Cory, and this community as you go out into the rest of your week.
Well, thank you, Reverend, and thank you all for joining the Swedenborgian Interfaith Community Podcast and webcast. We are your affirming interfaith community, so reach out to us anytime at swedenborgiancommunity.org, and also find us on YouTube, on pretty much every podcast app that you have, especially on iTunes and Stitcher and Podbean. And please connect with us. We want to hear your voice. We want to be uplifted and have the opportunity to uplift you. So go forth knowing you are quite loved.